What happens when the player some veterans quietly hoped would fade away becomes bigger than the system that tried to contain her? Not louder, not more dramatic, just bigger. Because this story isn't about a crossover appearance. It isn't about a feel-good TV moment. And it definitely isn't about a rookie getting lucky with media attention. This is about power. When Caitlin Clark stepped into a new role as a special contributor for NBC's flagship NBA coverage, it didn't feel experimental. It didn't feel like a promotional cameo. It felt deliberate, strategic, almost inevitable. Think about the optics. An active WNBA player, not retired, not transitioning, not easing into media, sitting alongside established basketball figures on a primetime national broadcast. Not talking about the WNBA. Not defending herself. Not responding to critics. Talking NBA basketball. That shift matters more than most people realize. For 2 seasons, the conversation around Clark has been controlled chaos. Record-breaking numbers. Sold-out arenas. Explosive ratings spikes. Endless debates about physical play. Heated discussions about attention. Veteran frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Some praised her impact. Others minimized it. Some welcomed the new fans. Others openly questioned them. But while that tension simmered inside the league, something else was happening outside of it. Networks were watching. Sponsors were measuring. Executives were tracking engagement data most fans never see. And the numbers didn't whisper. They screamed. NBC is not a startup experimenting with trends. It's a billion-dollar broadcast machine preparing for a massive NBA relaunch. When a network like that makes a move, it isn't emotional. It's calculated. Every face on screen is chosen for a reason. Every addition to a pregame desk is evaluated through audience modeling, advertising projections, and long-term growth strategies. And they chose Caitlin Clark. Not because she's controversial. Not because she's polarizing. But because she moves attention. That distinction changes everything. For months, one narrative kept resurfacing, that the league's growth was collective. That no single player was responsible. That the momentum would exist regardless of one rookie's arrival. But television executives don't operate on narratives. They operate on measurable impact. They study minute-by-minute viewership retention. They analyze demographic crossover. They track how many casual fans become repeat viewers. And the data tied to Clark didn't just show growth. It showed expansion. Expansion into markets that traditionally didn't watch women's basketball. Expansion into younger digital-first audiences. Expansion into mainstream sports circles that had rarely discussed the WNBA at length. So when NBC began building its new basketball coverage blueprint, they didn't just look at resumes. They looked at gravity. Who pulls eyes? Who holds them? Who converts attention into sustained engagement? And the answer was sitting in Indiana. While internal league conversations grew louder about revenue splits and salary structures, Clark's influence was quietly moving beyond those walls. She wasn't escalating public disputes. She wasn't fueling press conferences. She wasn't leaning into controversy for attention. She was building value. That's what makes this moment different. This wasn't a defiant statement. It wasn't retaliation. It wasn't a clapback. It was elevation. There's a difference between fighting for space inside a structure and outgrowing the structure entirely. And that's the uncomfortable part. Because when a player becomes larger than the internal politics surrounding her, the dynamic shifts. Control shifts. Leverage shifts. The conversation stops being about validation and starts being about inevitability. NBC didn't ask, should we give her a chance? They asked, how do we integrate her into the future of basketball coverage? That question says more than any headline ever could. For critics who insisted her impact was overstated, this move created tension. For supporters who believed she was redefining what was possible, it felt like confirmation. But for the league itself, it represented something more complicated. Because once a player proves she can command national primetime audiences beyond her own league, she's no longer confined by its ceiling. She's operating on a different axis. And the timing of it all couldn't be ignored. As negotiations intensified behind closed doors. As public messaging from player representatives grew sharper. As discussions about revenue, salary caps, and future seasons filled headlines. Clark stepped onto a platform that didn't require those debates. She didn't demand leverage. She demonstrated it. That's why this moment wasn't loud. It was decisive. The spotlight didn't shift because of controversy. It shifted because the market followed the attention. And when attention moves, power follows. So the real question isn't whether Caitlin Clark deserves a seat at that table. The real question is what happens next. When the player some veterans tried to contain begins operating on a stage that doesn't need their permission. Because if this is only the beginning of her influence beyond the court, the balance inside women's basketball may never look the same again. And what unfolds from here could redefine who truly controls the future of the sport. When NBC builds something, it doesn't experiment casually. This isn't a podcast invite. This isn't a local affiliate segment. This is Basketball Night in America, the network's flagship NBA property. The show designed to mirror the prestige and consistency of Sunday Night Football. The pregame desk that sets the tone before primetime matchups. And into that structure, they inserted an active WNBA player. Not as a guest appearance. As a contributor. That distinction matters. Because when networks bring in celebrities for buzz, they label it clearly. Special guest. Cameo. One-night feature. But the language around Clark was different. She was positioned alongside names that already carried decades of credibility in the sport. Carmelo Anthony. Tracy McGrady. Vince Carter. Reggie Miller. Hosted by Maria Taylor. That isn't experimentation. That's integration. The February debut wasn't random either. Lakers versus Knicks. Madison Square Garden. One of the most watched regular season environments in basketball. A high-pressure, high-visibility moment. NBC didn't ease her in during a quiet midweek broadcast. They put her on the main stage. Networks understand risk better than fans do. Every on-air move is calculated against viewer retention curves, demographic overlap, and sponsor alignment. Primetime NBA audiences skew differently than WNBA audiences. There's a broader casual fan layer. There's heavier advertiser presence. There's more scrutiny. If Clark failed in that environment, the numbers would show it immediately. But NBC didn't expect failure. They expected transfer. Transfer of audience. Transfer of curiosity. Transfer of momentum from one basketball ecosystem into another. And that's the part critics struggle to explain away. Because if her popularity were inflated, if her draw were temporary, if the so-called bandwagon effect were fragile, a network like NBC wouldn't build around it. They would wait. They didn't wait. They accelerated. Executives have access to real-time data that the public never sees. They can measure which clips trend organically versus which are boosted artificially. They track how many viewers stay after halftime. They analyze which players spike engagement during social media cross-posting. Clark's metrics weren't subtle. Her games consistently drove higher ratings. Her highlights traveled faster. Her name generated more cross-platform conversation than most established veterans. So NBC didn't take a gamble. They followed evidence. And there's another layer to this move that's even more strategic. Timing. The NBA is preparing for a massive broadcast relaunch cycle. Billions of dollars are tied to the next era of media rights and distribution strategy. Networks want faces that represent the future, not just the past. They want personalities who can bridge traditional broadcast with digital-first engagement. Clark checks that box effortlessly. She resonates with younger audiences who consume highlights on social platforms. She draws traditional sports viewers who still tune in to linear television. She appeals to advertisers targeting crossover markets. And she brings in fans who may not even consider themselves basketball fans yet. That blend is rare. That blend is valuable. And value always attracts infrastructure. While internal league discussions focused on salary caps and percentage splits, Clark quietly stepped into a role that expands her brand without limiting her to one negotiation table. That's what makes this different from endorsement deals or shoe partnerships. This is visibility within the NBA's ecosystem. That ecosystem dwarfs the WNBA in exposure scale. Sunday night broadcasts can pull multi-million viewership numbers. The advertising slots alone operate at levels that most women's sports programming hasn't historically reached. So when Clark sits at that desk, she isn't just analyzing plays. She's normalizing crossover authority. She's showing mainstream audiences that a WNBA player belongs in NBA conversations without qualifiers. No disclaimers. No novelty framing. Just basketball discussion. And here's the subtle power shift most people missed. For 2 seasons, debates around Clark often revolved around whether the attention was fair, whether the spotlight distribution felt balanced, whether coverage was excessive. NBC didn't enter that debate. They bypassed it. They treated her as a market asset. When a player's influence becomes measurable outside her league, she gains insulation. She's no longer entirely dependent on internal approval cycles. Her leverage isn't limited to collective bargaining outcomes. Her exposure isn't confined to seasonal scheduling. She becomes platform independent. That's rare. Most athletes, especially early in their careers, need the league structure to amplify them. Clark is beginning to operate in a space where the amplification flows both directions. The WNBA benefits from her visibility. But now, the NBA broadcast ecosystem benefits too. That mutual exchange elevates her positioning. And it complicates internal dynamics. Because when one player can command national primetime attention across leagues, the hierarchy changes. It's no longer about tenure. It's not about years served. It's not about internal seniority. It's about draw. NBC's decision was a public validation of draw. And validation from a billion-dollar network carries more weight than any internal debate ever could. The question isn't whether she'll perform well on air. The question is what happens to the balance of influence when she does. Because once audiences begin associating her with mainstream NBA coverage, her ceiling expands beyond what anyone originally projected. And that expansion doesn't ask for permission. Here's where the tension really starts. While Caitlin Clark was preparing to sit on a national NBA broadcast desk, something very different was happening behind closed doors inside the WNBA. Negotiations. Serious ones. The kind that determine whether a season runs smoothly or doesn't run at all. The collective bargaining agreement discussions heading toward 2026 weren't small adjustments. They were fundamental restructuring talks. Salary caps. Revenue share percentages. Maximum contracts. Long-term financial modeling for a league still stabilizing its expansion phase. And when the numbers started circulating publicly, the tone shifted fast. The players' side reportedly pushed for a salary cap around $10.5 million per team. They pushed for individual maximum salaries around $2.5 million. On the surface, that sounds bold, ambitious, progressive. But context changes everything. The league's current financial structure doesn't resemble the NBA's. Arena sizes are smaller. Media rights deals are smaller. Sponsorship pools are growing, but still developing. Operational costs haven't magically disappeared. Ownership reportedly countered with something that, in pure percentage terms, looked significant. A revenue share proposal around 70% of net revenue. Not gross. Net. That distinction became the flashpoint. Because gross revenue means slicing the pie before expenses. Net revenue means accounting for travel, arenas, marketing, staffing, insurance, infrastructure, the actual cost of running a professional sports league. And that's where public perception began to fracture. For 2 seasons, one of the loudest narratives surrounding Caitlin Clark's rise was that league growth was collective. That revenue increases weren't tied to one player. That attention spikes were part of broader momentum. But when salary demands rose in direct correlation with revenue growth, fans noticed something uncomfortable. If the revenue spike wasn't tied to Clark, then what exactly caused it? The timing created optics that were hard to ignore. Attendance surged during her rookie season. Television ratings spiked. Merchandise numbers climbed. National conversation exploded. And now, during CBA talks, those same revenue increases were central to salary arguments. That doesn't mean veteran players don't deserve raises. That doesn't mean salary growth isn't justified. Professional athletes should absolutely negotiate for better conditions. But perception matters in public negotiations. When certain veterans had previously downplayed the impact of new fans, sometimes openly questioning their authenticity, and then negotiations leaned heavily on revenue growth generated during that same period, the contradiction became visible. Fans aren't spreadsheets. They're emotional participants. And many felt like they were being dismissed one season and monetized the next. That feeling spreads quickly. Another phrase that didn't land well publicly was when certain offers were described as a slap in the face. Reports suggested proposed maximum salaries could cross $1 million under ownership structure, a dramatic jump from prior figures. In many industries, a seven-figure salary represents generational wealth territory. Language matters when negotiating in public. Calling $1 million framework insulting created friction with everyday fans watching from outside the league's internal economics. It's not about whether players deserve more. It's about how messaging lands. And while those negotiations intensified, Clark wasn't standing at a podium criticizing terms. She wasn't engaging in rhetorical escalation. She was stepping onto a primetime NBA broadcast. That contrast amplified everything. Because now the conversation wasn't just about percentages. It was about positioning. If one player can generate enough independent visibility to secure major national broadcasting roles that potentially rival or exceed top-tier WNBA salaries, then the power dynamics inside the league start to look different. Negotiation leverage depends on unity. But unity becomes complicated when one figure operates on a separate plane of exposure. Clark's NBC move didn't directly comment on the CBA. But indirectly, it reframed the entire context. She demonstrated market value outside collective bargaining structures. And that changes perception of dependency. If the 2026 season faced instability, if negotiations stalled further, if tensions escalated, Clark's personal platform would still expand. That reality adds another layer to negotiations. Because leverage works both ways. Players want increased compensation based on rising revenue. Ownership wants sustainable structures that protect long-term stability. But the presence of a transcendent draw complicates everything. The numbers weren't just awkward because they were large. They were awkward because they arrived at the exact moment one player's independent market validation became undeniable. And once the public connects those dots, the debate stops being strictly financial. It becomes symbolic. Who built the growth? Who owns the momentum? Who deserves the lion's share of credit? Those questions don't resolve quietly. And as negotiations dragged on, the deeper issue began to surface. It wasn't just about salary caps. It was about control. And control gets even more complicated when some of the people negotiating on behalf of players have interests extending beyond the league itself. This is where things stop being simple. Because salary debates? That's normal. Revenue splits? That's standard in professional sports. Public tension during CBA talks? Happens everywhere. But when the people leading negotiations may also benefit from instability inside the league they're negotiating with, the optics change. And optics matter. Two of the most influential voices in the WNBA Players Association hold leadership roles. They are respected stars, champions, established veterans. They are also co-founders and stakeholders in an off-season league called Unrivaled, a competing professional basketball venture designed to offer alternative contracts and exposure. On paper, that's entrepreneurship. Athletes building businesses. Expanding opportunity. Creating new platforms. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But here's where the discomfort begins. When you sit at a negotiating table pushing for higher WNBA salaries, while also owning a league that benefits if WNBA negotiations collapse, the lines blur. Even if intentions are pure, perception becomes complicated. Because a failed CBA benefits a competing product. If the WNBA season gets delayed, shortened, or threatened, alternative leagues gain leverage. If player dissatisfaction increases, alternative contracts become more attractive. That doesn't mean sabotage. It means incentive misalignment. And in professional sports, incentive alignment is everything. The uncomfortable question fans started asking wasn't accusatory. It was logical. Can someone negotiate stability while also profiting from instability? That question spread quickly once people connected the dots. Especially when negotiations stalled. Especially when public rhetoric intensified. Especially when no progress seemed visible. Fans began wondering whether aggressive demands were strategic positioning, or something else. Again, no accusations. Just optics. In most corporate industries, leadership roles with overlapping competitive interests would require firewalls, disclosures, structural separation. Professional sports operate in a looser space. Player unions are built differently. Athlete entrepreneurship is celebrated. But when negotiations appear to stall repeatedly while a rival venture gains publicity and investment, suspicion grows naturally. And that suspicion grows louder when social media amplifies every quote, every press appearance, every public statement. The most dangerous thing in negotiations isn't disagreement. It's doubt. Once fans begin doubting whether negotiations are purely about collective welfare, trust erodes. And trust is currency. What made this even more complicated was timing. As Clark's visibility expanded nationally, Nike campaigns, sold-out arenas, record-setting ratings, the off-season league positioned itself as an alternative power structure. Instead of aligning with the momentum, it felt separate, parallel, competitive. While Clark built partnerships that extended women's basketball into mainstream NBA ecosystems, some union leaders built platforms that existed outside the WNBA structure entirely. That contrast sharpened perception. One strategy expands the tent. The other fragments it. Whether intentional or not, that's how many fans began interpreting it. And once interpretation shifts, narratives solidify. Supporters started asking harder questions. If revenue growth is tied to rising popularity, if rising popularity is tied to star power, if star power is tied to one central figure, then why does internal leadership appear divided rather than unified? Why escalate publicly instead of stabilizing privately? Why risk season disruption when momentum feels fragile? These questions aren't anti-player. They're pro-stability. Fans don't obsess over revenue math. They obsess over games being played. When the possibility of a disrupted 2026 season started entering conversation, anxiety grew. Because for casual fans, especially new ones, instability kills interest faster than controversy ever could. And this is where Clark's positioning becomes even more strategic. She isn't tied to the internal optics battle. She isn't co-owning competing ventures. She isn't leading public protests. She isn't issuing inflammatory soundbites. She's building quietly, while others negotiate loudly. That difference in approach becomes amplified when negotiations drag. The longer the CBA remains unresolved, the more contrast appears. And contrast shapes perception faster than press releases ever will. In moments like this, leadership is judged not just by demands, but by clarity. And right now, clarity feels blurred. Not because anyone has proven wrongdoing, but because the incentive map looks complicated. When influence splits across parallel ventures, loyalty questions surface, even if they're unfair. And once fans sense divided priorities, public support begins to wobble. Which leads to the next layer of this story. Because once fans started questioning negotiation optics, they didn't stay quiet. They reacted. And the reaction wasn't subtle. Public negotiations are delicate. You can demand more money. You can reject offers. You can posture strategically. But once the optics shift, you lose control of the narrative. And that's exactly what started happening. Images began circulating online. Players outside league offices. Inflatable rats. Protest-style visuals. Chants. Signs. Frustration spilling into public view. In isolation, protest imagery isn't shocking. Labor movements have always used symbolism. Athletes have marched before. Visibility can be powerful. But context changes perception. When the public sees six-figure earners protesting million-dollar proposals while the league is still financially stabilizing, the symbolism lands differently. Fair or unfair, that's how perception works. The slap in the face phrasing didn't help either. Because language carries weight beyond negotiation rooms. When an offer reportedly exceeding 7 figures gets framed as disrespectful, everyday viewers recalibrate emotionally. Most fans aren't owners. They're not union leaders. They're not executives. They're teachers, nurses, retail workers, students, parents. They measure numbers against their own reality. And when phrasing sounds disconnected from that reality, public sympathy thins. Not because players don't deserve raises, but because tone matters. The internet doesn't debate financial modeling. It reacts to optics. And reaction came fast. Comment sections shifted. Neutral fans became critical. Even some longtime supporters began questioning messaging strategy. Not the desire for better pay, but the delivery. Social media amplified everything. Clips of press statements circulated without nuance. Screenshots of demands spread without context. Shortened quotes traveled faster than full explanations. That's the modern media environment. And in that environment, perception outruns clarification. Meanwhile, something else was happening at the exact same time. Caitlin Clark remained silent. No press conference escalation. No pointed commentary. No public side-taking. She wasn't dismissing negotiations. She just wasn't centering herself in them. That silence created contrast. While union rhetoric grew louder, Clark's public presence felt controlled. Professional. Measured. She was preparing for a national broadcast appearance while the discourse online intensified around CBA friction. The difference in tone became visible. And once visible, it became narrative. Because humans instinctively compare behaviors. One side appeared confrontational. The other appeared composed. Again, perception. Not necessarily full truth. But perception shapes loyalty. Even within the league, subtle comments from analysts and former players began reflecting concern. Not about the desire for salary growth, but about messaging discipline. When former athletes caution that public rhetoric might be costing goodwill, it signals something deeper. Momentum in sports is fragile. The WNBA had entered a period of unprecedented visibility. Ratings climbed. Arenas filled. National discussions expanded. Corporate interest grew. But growth phases are delicate. If public sentiment fractures during a growth window, recovery takes time. And in this specific moment, the fracture wasn't about basketball performance. It was about optics. Inflatable rats became memes. Protest images became reaction GIFs. Clips of heated commentary were reposted with sarcastic captions. Fair or not, once the internet turned symbolic imagery into punchlines, you've lost narrative control. And that loss matters during negotiations. Because public pressure influences leverage. Owners watch sentiment too. Sponsors monitor brand association. Broadcast partners evaluate long-term viability. When optics tilt unstable, all stakeholders adjust cautiously. That's why this moment feels different from past CBA tension. The league wasn't negotiating quietly behind closed doors while operating in relative obscurity. This time, negotiations unfolded during peak visibility. Under a microscope. And right as that microscope zoomed in, Clark stepped onto a separate stage entirely. One insulated from those optics. She didn't need to criticize anyone. She didn't need to defend anyone. Her positioning spoke for itself. National primetime. NBA platform. Mainstream integration. While debates about percentages dominated one corner of the basketball world, she occupied another corner entirely. The separation widened. And once separation widens during conflict, hierarchy recalibrates. Because audiences instinctively gravitate toward stability. When one figure appears steady amid turbulence, loyalty shifts quietly. Not dramatically, not explosively, just gradually. And gradual shifts often have the most lasting impact. The protests didn't destroy public support overnight. But they cracked something. A subtle skepticism. A hesitation. A growing question. Is this about growth or ego? That question, once seeded, spreads. And once public trust wavers, rebuilding it takes more effort than preserving it ever would have. Meanwhile, Clark kept building. And the deeper this contrast becomes, the more inevitable the power shift begins to feel. Because the market rewards composure during chaos. And right now, composure carries weight. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just expands quietly. While debates grew louder, while timelines filled with screenshots and protest images, Caitlin Clark stayed focused on one thing: positioning. Not reacting. Positioning. There's a difference. Reacting keeps you inside the argument. Positioning moves you above it. Clark didn't publicly criticize the union. She didn't challenge veteran players. She didn't lean into controversy for clicks. She kept building. That's what makes this moment so strategic. Because while others fought over internal percentages, she stepped into external validation. Primetime NBA coverage. Mainstream sponsorship integration. National cross-demographic exposure. These moves weren't emotional responses. They were long-term leverage plays. And here's the subtle shift most people missed. When a player proves she can command attention outside her league's ecosystem, she becomes less dependent on internal approval structures. That changes everything. Historically, young stars in any league need validation from veterans. They need acceptance from locker room hierarchies. They need integration into established power circles. Clark skipped that step. Not intentionally. Not aggressively. But effectively. Her validation came from networks. From corporate partners. From audience growth data. That kind of validation is external. And external validation is harder to contain. Inside the WNBA, debates centered around fairness, respect, balance, historical contribution. Outside the WNBA, the only currency was measurable impact. And measurable impact favored Clark. That's not a value judgment. It's a market observation. NBC didn't choose her because she argued well. They chose her because she draws. Sponsors didn't align with her because of internal politics. They aligned because of consumer pull. That's the silent strategy. She never needed to confront anyone directly. Her trajectory confronted the narrative for her. And as her platform expanded, something else happened quietly. Her risk profile decreased. If negotiations stall, she still has national exposure. If tensions rise, her brand remains insulated. If internal politics intensify, she operates beyond them. That insulation is rare. Most players' leverage depends entirely on collective agreements. Clark's leverage now includes independent broadcasting presence. That creates asymmetry. Not unfairly, but undeniably. And asymmetry shifts perception inside locker rooms too. Veteran players built the league through years of sacrifice. Lower salaries. Limited exposure. Minimal national attention. That foundation deserves respect. But market timing is ruthless. Clark arrived during a media inflection point. Streaming platforms expanded. Social media accelerated virality. Women's sports entered a new growth phase. She became the face of that wave. Whether anyone likes it or not. And instead of fighting the resistance, she avoided it. That avoidance wasn't weakness. It was discipline. When conflict intensifies, the strongest long-term strategy is often non-engagement. Let critics talk. Let negotiations unfold. Let the noise circulate. Then step onto a larger stage. The NBC desk isn't just a media role. It's a signal. A signal that she belongs in conversations beyond internal league politics. A signal that her basketball IQ translates across platforms. A signal that mainstream sports ecosystems see her as an asset, not a controversy. And here's the most important part. She did this while still playing. She didn't wait for retirement to transition into broadcasting. She didn't wait for decades of tenure to earn analysis credibility. She expanded in real time. That compresses timelines. And when timelines compress, hierarchies adjust. The veterans who once controlled media narratives inside the league now share airspace with a player whose reach extends nationally. That's not displacement. It's redistribution. But redistribution feels uncomfortable when it happens quickly. Clark never framed herself as a disruptor. But disruption happened anyway. Because the market doesn't negotiate emotions. It follows demand. And demand followed her. That's the silent strategy. Not confrontation. Expansion. And expansion is difficult to argue against, because it doesn't require approval. It just requires audience. And once the audience grows large enough, influence becomes self-sustaining. Which brings us to the part that makes this shift permanent. The numbers. At some point, emotion has to give way to math. Not opinions. Not loyalty. Not seniority. Math. Because in professional sports, audience size isn't just vanity. It's currency. And the currency gap here is significant. Primetime NBA broadcasts regularly draw multi-million viewer numbers. Even mid-tier matchups often clear thresholds that most professional women's sports games are still working toward. That isn't criticism. It's scale. So when Caitlin Clark appears on a flagship NBA pregame show, she isn't stepping into a niche ecosystem. She's entering a mainstream pipeline that reaches households far beyond traditional WNBA viewership. That exposure multiplier matters. Because audience transfer works both ways. Some NBA viewers who tune in for Lakers versus Knicks will see Clark analyzing matchups. Some will become curious. Some will follow her back to the WNBA. Some will watch highlights. Some will buy merchandise. That cross-pollination is invaluable. And NBC understands that better than anyone. This wasn't about novelty. It was about bridging markets. Clark sits at a rare intersection. She resonates with core basketball fans. She resonates with casual sports viewers. She resonates with younger digital native audiences. She resonates with new fans discovering women's basketball for the first time. That demographic versatility is rare. And networks chase versatility. The WNBA's average viewership, while improving, still operates in a different numerical range than NBA primetime programming. That's not a value judgment about quality of play. It's simply the current media reality. So when Clark appears in an NBA broadcast ecosystem, she's operating inside a higher exposure bracket. And exposure compounds. One primetime appearance leads to more familiarity. More familiarity leads to comfort. Comfort leads to retention. The more viewers see her in authoritative basketball discussions, the less she's framed as a novelty story. She becomes normalized. And normalization is powerful. Because once mainstream audiences accept her presence in NBA conversations, the hierarchy changes subconsciously. She's no longer just the WNBA rookie who draws ratings. She's a basketball mind trusted at the highest broadcast level. That perception feeds back into negotiations indirectly. When ownership sees independent national validation, it strengthens their understanding of individual market value. When sponsors see cross-league integration, it boosts brand alignment confidence. When fans see her operating comfortably alongside Hall of Fame names, it solidifies her legitimacy beyond debate. And here's where it gets even more strategic. Sunday night NBA broadcasts often outperform weekday games significantly. The advertising rates are higher. The spotlight is brighter. The social media chatter is heavier. Clark's debut timing places her inside that premium window. If her segments generate engagement spikes, and early indicators suggest curiosity alone drives traffic, then her future appearances become even more valuable. That creates leverage beyond salary. Because visibility equals negotiating power. If a player's presence can influence national broadcast interest, that player holds intangible weight. Not because she demands it, but because she generates it. And while CBA discussions revolve around percentage splits, Clark is quietly expanding the overall pie by pulling more eyes into the broader basketball ecosystem. That doesn't mean she alone drives growth. But it does mean she amplifies it. Amplification changes leverage math. Because the more she operates in dual ecosystems, WNBA and NBA broadcast, the more insulated her brand becomes from any single structural outcome. If 2026 negotiations drag, she still has mainstream visibility. If public sentiment fractures, she remains positioned within national sports coverage. If internal politics escalate, her platform doesn't shrink. That insulation isn't common for second-year players. It usually takes decades. Clark achieved it in 2 seasons. And that timeline compression is what makes veterans uneasy. Not necessarily because they resent her, but because the hierarchy moved faster than expected. Audience math doesn't ask who paid dues longest. It rewards who captures attention most efficiently. And right now, Clark captures attention at a scale the league hasn't seen before. The audience gap isn't permanent. The WNBA is growing. Expansion teams are coming. Media deals are improving. But growth phases require stability. If public trust wavers during negotiations, that growth slows. And that's the deeper tension. Because while some internal voices escalate rhetoric, Clark's exposure continues scaling upward. The more she integrates into mainstream NBA coverage, the more permanent her influence becomes. And once influence becomes permanent, it's no longer reactive. It's foundational. Which brings us to the emotional layer behind all of this. Because beneath negotiations, behind optics, beyond ratings, there's something more human at play. Adjustment. And adjustment is never comfortable when it happens this fast. Here's the part people don't say out loud. This isn't just about money. It's about adjustment. For years, the WNBA operated within a familiar hierarchy. Veterans carried the league through lean seasons. Stars built credibility brick by brick. Exposure grew gradually. Respect was earned over time. Then everything accelerated. Caitlin Clark didn't just enter the league. She entered during a cultural shift. Streaming expanded. Women's sports visibility surged. Social media compressed attention cycles. Corporate sponsors searched aggressively for crossover faces. She arrived at the exact moment the market was ready to explode. That timing isn't something anyone can control. Just happens. But when acceleration hits that fast, adjustment becomes uncomfortable. Because suddenly, years of incremental progress are overshadowed by one tidal wave of attention. Veterans who sacrificed through quieter seasons now share headlines with a rookie whose impact feels disproportionate. That doesn't erase their contributions. But it does change perception. And perception influences ego. Professional athletes are competitors. They measure respect through visibility, contracts, awards, coverage. When the spotlight concentrates heavily on one figure, internal tension becomes natural. Not malicious. Not villainous. Human. Add in physical play controversies from Clark's rookie season. The hard fouls, the heated matchups, the debates about officiating, and the tension amplified. Some framed it as rookie initiation. Others saw it as resentment. The truth likely lives somewhere in between. But what matters isn't intention. It's interpretation. New fans interpreted those moments as hostility toward the league's most visible star. Veteran fans interpreted them as normal competitive intensity. The split widened. And once public perception splits, unity becomes harder to maintain. Clark, meanwhile, never escalated publicly. She absorbed hits, answered questions carefully, avoided inflammatory responses. That restraint changed the emotional equation. Because when one side appears visibly frustrated and the other appears composed, neutrality tilts. Again, perception. This adjustment phase is bigger than any single play or negotiation. It's about control. For years, the league controlled its narrative tightly. Media coverage was measured. Exposure was steady but limited. Growth was organic. Now the spotlight is national. Debates trend daily. Clip culture amplifies every gesture. The league no longer controls the volume. And when volume increases rapidly, gatekeeping weakens. That's the uncomfortable truth. The old guard built the foundation. But the market doesn't freeze time to honor history. It accelerates toward opportunity. Clark represents opportunity. She didn't ask to be the symbol of transition. But she became it. And transitions always unsettle structures. Some veterans adjusted quickly. Others resisted the framing. But resistance doesn't slow market demand. It only amplifies contrast. And contrast is what shaped this entire narrative. On one side, negotiations, public protests, rhetorical escalation, frustration spilling outward. On the other side, primetime broadcast integration, corporate alignment, measured interviews, quiet expansion. Neither side is entirely right or wrong. But one side feels stable. And audiences gravitate toward stability. The most telling part of this adjustment phase isn't what players said. It's what they didn't say. Very few veterans openly congratulated Clark's NBC move. Very few publicly framed it as collective progress. Silence can mean many things. Respect, distance, disagreement, uncertainty. But in high-visibility moments, silence reads loudly. Because when the league's most nationally visible player steps onto a historic broadcast platform, and the reaction feels muted internally, the public notices. And once the public notices, narrative solidifies. Clark didn't replace anyone. She didn't demand hierarchy changes. She simply expanded faster than the structure expected. That expansion forces recalibration. The adjustment now isn't optional. It's necessary. Because the 2026 season isn't just another year. It represents a fork in the road. Stability leads to growth. Fragmentation slows it. And the presence of a transcendent draw complicates both paths. Which brings us to the final question that defines everything moving forward. What does this shift actually mean for the future? Strip away the headlines. Remove the emotion. Forget the memes. What's left is leverage. And 2026 is where leverage becomes real. If negotiations stabilize, the league enters its next phase with unprecedented visibility. Expansion teams, larger media packages, rising average salaries, a new generation of fans already invested. That's the ideal outcome. But if negotiations stall, if rhetoric escalates further, if public trust erodes, the growth window narrows. Momentum in sports is fragile. It doesn't wait patiently for resolution. It either compounds, or it dissipates. And here's where Caitlin Clark's positioning becomes the ultimate wild card. She is no longer entirely dependent on internal league outcomes for visibility. That's new. If a lockout happens, her platform doesn't disappear. If season delays occur, her brand remains active. If negotiations fracture unity, her exposure remains national. That changes the internal power equation whether anyone acknowledges it or not. Because historically, collective leverage depended on unity. The more united players appeared, the stronger their bargaining position. But when one player has independent mainstream access and corporate backing strong enough to operate outside that structure, the unity dynamic shifts. It doesn't collapse. It recalibrates. Clark represents the first true cross-ecosystem figure the league has seen at this scale. She's not just a star inside the WNBA. She's becoming a basketball figure, period. And once a player crosses into that category, the ceiling changes permanently. That doesn't mean veterans lose relevance. It means hierarchy modernizes. Younger fans don't consume sports the way older generations did. They follow personalities across platforms. They support individuals as much as teams. They watch clips more than full games. They engage through digital commentary rather than box scores. Clark thrives in that ecosystem. She isn't fighting it. She embodies it. So when 2026 negotiations reach their final phase, the stakes aren't just financial. They're structural. Does the league unify around growth and stabilize messaging? Or does internal division overshadow the most valuable expansion window in league history? Because this is bigger than one salary cap. It's about long-term positioning. If the WNBA enters 2026 unified, with Clark operating both as a league superstar and a national basketball personality, the upside is massive. If fragmentation dominates headlines, sponsors grow cautious. Casual fans drift. Momentum softens. And here's the reality nobody wants to admit. The league needs Clark. Not exclusively. Not singularly. But significantly. Her draw is measurable. Her crossover appeal is rare. Her ability to convert new fans into long-term followers is proven. That doesn't diminish anyone else's contributions. It amplifies them. Because star gravity lifts surrounding talent. The most sustainable growth model isn't suppressing breakout figures. It's integrating them into the collective narrative. Clark's NBC move wasn't a rebellion. It was evolution. It showed what's possible when talent meets timing. And that evolution forces every stakeholder, players, owners, sponsors, networks, to think differently. Control no longer sits solely within league offices. Influence no longer depends strictly on tenure. Exposure no longer requires retirement transitions. The future looks faster, more fluid, less hierarchical. And that's uncomfortable for traditional structures. But it's also inevitable. So when people ask whether Caitlin Clark's NBC role is just a broadcasting gig, they're missing the bigger picture. It's validation. It's insulation. It's leverage. It's proof that the market doesn't wait for internal permission. And if 2026 becomes the defining year for the WNBA's next chapter, this moment, this quiet power shift, will be remembered as the turning point. Not because she argued louder. Not because she demanded more. But because she expanded further. And expansion is hard to contain once it starts. This was never about jealousy. It was never about one contract. It was about control. For 2 seasons, debates tried to frame Caitlin Clark as overhyped, overcovered, overprotected, overpraised. But markets don't operate on feelings. They operate on demand. NBC didn't choose her because of controversy. They chose her because she delivers attention. And attention, in modern sports, equals power. While others argued about percentages, she increased her surface area. While negotiations stalled, she scaled visibility. While optics turned messy, she stayed measured. That's not accidental. That's strategic. The league now stands at a crossroads. Stability could turn this era into the most profitable, unified growth phase in WNBA history. Division could slow momentum at the exact moment opportunity is highest. And whether fans love her or critique her, one thing is undeniable. Caitlin Clark has already altered the leverage landscape. The question isn't whether that's fair. The question is how everyone adapts. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about where this league is heading. And right now, this channel is small, but the conversations we're building here are big. If you want deep breakdowns like this, not surface-level headlines, not recycled takes, but real analysis of the power shifts happening in women's basketball, hit subscribe. Not casually, intentionally. Because subscriber growth directly impacts how often YouTube recommends this content. More subscribers means more visibility. More visibility means stronger discussions. And stronger discussions help shape how this era is understood. If you found value in this breakdown, tap the like button. That engagement signal tells the algorithm this topic matters. And most importantly, drop a comment. Do you think Clark's NBC move changes the power balance? Are the CBA demands justified? Is the league unified or fractured? The comments section isn't just for opinions. It's data. And data drives the future of this channel. Subscribe, like, comment, because the next phase of this story is already unfolding, and you don't want to miss what happens next.